Beijing, 1793. The Qianlong Emperor sits on his throne as British diplomat Lord George Macartney kneels before him, offering gifts, telescopes, clocks, weapons, the finest products of the Industrial Revolution. The Emperor looks at these trinkets and says something that will echo through history. "We possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious and have no use for your country's manufactures." At that moment, China controlled 33% of global GDP. Britain, less than 5%. China was the world's largest economy, the most technologically advanced civilization, the undisputed superpower. But here's what makes this moment haunting. The Qianlong Emperor was speaking at the exact peak of a 250-year cycle. Within 50 years, China would be carved into pieces by foreign powers. Within 150 years, it would be one of the poorest nations on earth. And here's what should terrify the West. That same 250-year cycle is now swinging back. Because empires don't rise and fall randomly. They follow a mathematical pattern that has repeated for over 2,000 years. And right now, we're watching it happen again in real time. Let me show you the formula. For the last 2 millennia, dominant civilizations have risen and fallen in roughly 250-year cycles. Not 100 years, not 500 years, 250 years, give or take a generation. China's cycle collapsed between 1839 and 1949, exactly 110 years. That's the standard collapse duration. But here's the thing about these cycles. The collapse period always equals the rebuild period. China spent 110 years falling. It's now spending 110 years rising. And the math says we're approaching the inflection point. The West dismissed China's rise as an economic miracle, an anomaly, something that could be stopped with tariffs or sanctions. But what if it wasn't a miracle at all? What if it was just the universe correcting to its mathematical mean? What if China's rise was as inevitable as gravity? I'm going to prove to you that it was. And then I'm going to show you exactly where we are in the cycle right now. Let's start with the pattern itself, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. The Roman Empire, 27 BCE to 476 CE. Rome dominated for approximately 500 years, but here's what most people miss. It rose and fell in distinct 250-year phases. The rise. 262 years of expansion, wealth accumulation, infrastructure building. At its peak, under Trajan in 117 CE, Rome controlled 5 million square kilometers and 65 million people. Phase 2, the decline. 241 years of overextension, currency debasement, military weakness, and ultimately collapse. That's why historians mark 235 CE as the crisis of the 3rd century. It wasn't random, it was the mathematical midpoint where the empire's energy reversed. The Islamic Golden Age, 750 to 1258 CE. Now watch the pattern repeat. The Abbasid Caliphate rose to dominance around 750 CE. For 250 years, Baghdad was the intellectual and economic center of the world. While Europe wallowed in the Dark Ages, Islamic scholars preserved and advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad contained the world's largest library. Islamic mathematicians invented algebra. Their merchants controlled trade routes from Spain to China. But in 1258, exactly 508 years after the beginning of the Abbasid Caliphate, the Mongols sacked Baghdad. The cycle had turned. And here's the eerie part. The decline phase lasted about 250 years, just like Rome. The Mongol Empire, 1206 to 1368. The Mongols conquered the largest contiguous land empire in history, 24 million square kilometers at its peak under Kublai Khan. From 1206 to 1368, they dominated Eurasia. That's 162 years shorter than the full cycle because the Mongols burned too hot, expanded too fast. But watch what happens after their collapse in 1368. The Ming Dynasty takes power in China, and China enters its next 250-year dominance cycle. Are you starting to see it? Here's where the pattern becomes undeniable, because China has already completed multiple 250-year cycles. We have the historical data. We can measure it precisely. In 1368, the Ming Dynasty expelled the Mongols and unified China. What followed was 471 years of dominance, split into 2 clear phases. By the early 1400s, China was conducting treasure voyages that dwarfed anything Europe could imagine. Admiral Zheng He commanded fleets of over 300 ships, some measuring 120 meters long. That's larger than anything the West would build for another 400 years. Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea dominated global trade. The Ming economy was so productive that by 1600, China represented approximately 35% of global GDP. Europe, about 25% combined. Phase 2. The Qing continuation. In 1644, the Qing dynasty replaced the Ming, but the dominance continued. In fact, it accelerated. By 1820, China's GDP reached its historical peak, $228 billion, representing 32.9% of global economic output. To put this in perspective, in 1820, China's economy was larger than all of Europe and both Americas combined. That brings us back to the Qianlong Emperor in 1793, dismissing British gifts. He wasn't being arrogant, he was stating observable fact. China didn't need the West needed China. But he was speaking from the peak, and peaks are always followed by valleys. In 1839, the First Opium War began. Britain, unable to compete economically, forced China to accept drug imports at gunpoint. This started what the Chinese call the Century of Humiliation. By 1949, China's share of global GDP had collapsed to just 4.6%, from 33% to 4.6% in 110 years. That's an 86% decline. But here's what Western economists missed. The collapse duration was 110 years, which means, according to the pattern, the recovery duration should also be approximately 110 years. In 1949, Mao Zedong stood at Tiananmen Square and declared the People's Republic of China. The country was shattered. Life expectancy was 35 years. GDP per capita was $50. Literacy rate was 20%. By every measure, China was a failed state. But something extraordinary happened. Watch how precisely China's rise matches the empire cycle formula. Phase 1, foundation laying. Mao's era was catastrophic in many ways. The Great Leap Forward killed 30 million. The Cultural Revolution destroyed intellectual capital. But it did one thing the empire cycle requires. It unified the nation and built baseline infrastructure. By 1978, literacy had risen to 65%. Life expectancy reached 65 years. China had gone from fractured warlord states to unified nation-state. The foundation was set. Phase 2, economic ignition, 1978 to 2001. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping opened China to foreign investment. What happened next wasn't a miracle. It was mathematical regression to the mean. By 2001, its GDP had grown from $150 billion to $1.3 trillion. But that's still only 4% of global GDP. The cycle had barely begun. Phase 3, the Great Acceleration, 2001 to 2025. Here's where the pattern becomes undeniable. After joining the World Trade Organization, China didn't just grow, it grew at precisely the rate required to restore its historical position. 2001, $1.3 trillion GDP, 2010, $6.1 trillion GDP, 2020, $14.7 trillion GDP, 2025, $19.5 trillion GDP, approximately 19% of global total. Do you see what's happening? China is recovering its share of global GDP at an average rate of 0.6 percentage points per year. At this rate, it will return to its historical 30 to 33% share by approximately 2045. That's 96 years after 1949. The full recovery cycle, 110 years of collapse, 110 years of recovery. The math is holding, but it's not just GDP. Look at the other indicators. China has built 45,000 kilometers of high-speed rail since 2008. The rest of the world combined has built 20,000 kilometers. China produces 57% of the world's steel, 60% of the world's cement. China has more 5G base stations than the rest of the world combined, 3.3 million versus 1.1 million. In 2023, China filed 1,000 international patents. USA filed 55,000 China graduates, 5 million STEM students annually. USA graduates about 500,000. China produces 80% of the world's solar panels, 76% of lithium-ion batteries, 60% of wind turbines. China represents 35% of global manufacturing output. USA, 12%. China is the largest trading partner for 120 countries. USA, 56 countries. This isn't random. This is mathematical reversion. China spent 2,000 years representing about 30% of global economic output. The 1839 collapse was the anomaly. What we're watching now is the correction. So if this pattern is so obvious, why didn't Western analysts see it coming? Because they made 3 critical errors. Error 1, recency bias. Western economists assumed the world as it existed in 1950 was the natural order. America dominates, Europe matters, China is poor. That's just how things are. But 1950 was the aberration. For 18 of the last 20 centuries, China was the world's largest economy. Error 2, ideological blindness. Western thinkers convinced themselves that free market capitalism was the only path to prosperity. China's state-directed model couldn't work because it violated economic orthodoxy. But empires don't care about your economic theory. They care about execution. And China executed the empire cycle playbook perfectly. That's the same playbook Rome used, the same playbook the Islamic Golden Age used, the same playbook Ming China used. It works regardless of whether you call it communism, capitalism, or feudalism. Error. 3. Linear thinking. Western analysts projected China's growth linearly. If China grows at 10% for 30 more years, they'll be bigger than the USA. Then they'd explain why 10% growth was impossible to sustain. But empire cycles aren't linear. They're exponential during recovery phases. China didn't need to sustain 10% growth. It needed to follow the curve of historical restoration, and that curve is accelerating. Look at this data point. In 2023, China's economy grew by $1.5 trillion in absolute terms. That's more than the entire GDP of Russia. China is adding Russia-sized economies every single year, because that's what empires do during restoration phases. They don't grow incrementally, they explode. So here's the question that matters. Where are we right now in China's 250-year cycle? The collapse began in 1839. It bottomed in 1949. That's 110 years down. If the pattern holds, the recovery should complete around 2059. That means we're currently at 2025, 76 years into a 110-year recovery cycle. That's 69% complete. And here's what history tells us about 70% completion points. This is where the rising empire begins actively challenging the declining empire for dominance. Watch what China is doing right now. China has invested over $1 trillion in infrastructure across 150 countries. That's not aid, that's empire building. Rome built roads, Britain built railroads. China is building ports, highways, and 5G networks across Eurasia. In 2010, 0% of international trade was settled in yuan. By 2024, it's 4.7% and rising. China and Saudi Arabia are negotiating oil sales in yuan. China and Brazil are trading in local currencies, bypassing the dollar entirely. China launched its third aircraft carrier in 2022. By 2030, it will have 6. The US has 11, but China's are newer, built with modern technology. China is systematically eliminating dependence on Western technology. Huawei builds 5G without American chips. Smikey manufactures 7-nanometer processors despite US sanctions. This is what rising empires do at the 70% mark. They stop accepting the existing order and start building their own. Now here's where the empire cycle gets dangerous, because there's always a collision point. When Rome rose, it collided with Carthage. Result, 3 Punic Wars. Carthage destroyed. When the Islamic Caliphate rose, it collided with Byzantium. Result, 400 years of warfare. Byzantine Empire gradually consumed. When Britain rose, it collided with France and Spain. Result, 100 Years' War. War of Spanish Succession, Napoleonic Wars. When America rose, it collided with Britain, then Germany, then the Soviet Union. Result, War of 1812, 2 world wars, Cold War. Every single time a rising empire reaches 70% completion, it collides with the declining empire. Every single time. So where are we in the America-China collision? Phase 1, economic competition. This phase was relatively peaceful. China joined World Trade Organization, grew rapidly, everyone got richer. America didn't see China as a threat yet. Phase 2, trade war. Trump launched tariffs. Biden continued them. This is the maybe we can stop this phase. You can't stop a 250-year cycle with tariffs. Phase 3, technology decoupling. Now it's getting serious. US bans Chinese access to advanced semiconductors. China responds by building domestic alternatives. Both sides are preparing for parallel technology ecosystems. Phase 4, the danger zone. Here's what history tells us happens next. The rising empire makes a move that the declining empire cannot accept. For China, that move is almost certainly Taiwan. Taiwan produces 92% of the world's advanced semiconductors. Controlling Taiwan would give China leverage over the entire global economy. That's why China will eventually move to reunify it. Not might, will. And when that happens, America faces an impossible choice. Intervene and risk direct war with a nuclear power, or step aside and acknowledge that the Pacific is no longer American-dominated. That's the collision point, and we're approaching it fast. So how does this end? History offers 3 templates. Outcome 1, peaceful transition. Britain transferred global dominance to America relatively peacefully between 1914 and 1945. There was cooperation, shared language and culture, and ultimately, Britain accepted its diminished role. Could America and China do the same? The optimistic case, China becomes the world's largest economy. America remains prosperous but accepts a multipolar world. Trade continues. War is avoided. Both nations coexist. Probability based on historical precedent, 20%. Declining empires rarely accept decline peacefully, especially when the cultures are as different as America and China. Outcome 2, managed competition. This is the Cold War model. 2 empires, 2 systems, limited direct conflict but constant proxy battles, technology decoupling, sphere of influence divisions, arms races, but stopping short of direct war. The realistic case, America and China establish clear boundaries. China dominates Asia and Africa through Belt and Road. America maintains influence in Europe and the Americas. Neither directly challenges the other's core interests. Probability, 50%. This is where current policy seems headed. Outcome 3, catastrophic conflict. This is the World War I or II model. Rising empire challenges declining empire. Declining empire refuses to accept the new order. Direct military conflict follows. The nightmare scenario, war over Taiwan escalates into broader conflict. The global economy collapses. Nuclear weapons enter consideration. Millions die. Probability, 30%. Higher than most people think, because history shows that collision points often spiral out of control. Here's what you need to understand. China's rise wasn't an accident, a miracle, or something that could have been prevented with better policy. It was mathematical destiny. For 2,000 years, China represented approximately 30% of global economic output. The 1839 to 1949 collapse was a 110-year anomaly caused by technological disruption and internal chaos. What we're witnessing now is the 110-year restoration. The empire cycle is 69% complete. By 2045, China will likely control 35% of global GDP again. By 2059, the cycle completes, and China will be the world's undisputed economic superpower. This isn't prophecy, it's pattern recognition. The West had 200 years of dominance. That was the aberration. Now the universe is correcting back to its mathematical mean, and we're living through the correction. The Qianlong Emperor in 1793 said China needed nothing from Britain. He was right, but he was also standing at the peak, seconds before the fall. Today, Western leaders say China will never surpass America. They're wrong, but they're also standing at the peak, seconds before the transition. The 250-year cycle is turned. The question isn't whether China will rise. It already has. The question is whether the transition will be peaceful or catastrophic. History says catastrophic transitions are more common. That's why the next 10 years might be the most dangerous in human history. If this changed how you see the world, share it with someone who still thinks American dominance is permanent. Subscribe, because next, we're exploring which countries are positioning themselves to benefit from the China-America transition, and why most of them aren't who you'd expect. The empire cycle waits for no one.